Well, I'm delighted to welcome our speaker today, Owen Broadway, a historic building and conservation officer. Owen, I'm going to actually let you do the job of introducing yourself because I don't really know the best way to explain either your background or your job title. But over to you. In fact, actually, that might involve me unmuting you because otherwise, no, you're unmuted, Owen. Over to you.
Brilliant, thank you. Thanks for the introduction, Ian. I've spent nearly 20 years now working in planning. I've worked exclusively in local authority. The main thrust of my role at the moment is that I manage a team of specialist consultees that contribute directly into the development management process. I sit within planning policy in a local authority, and part of that planning policy team deals with Section 106 and CIL payments. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. So yeah, Ian, if we could start clicking the presentation through, that'd be great. So just a brief overview of what I wanted to take you all through. I suspect that many of you here will be pretty well informed and will already have a very good idea of what Section 106 and CIL does. But in order to just establish a baseline of understanding, I thought I would just go through them both quickly and crucially sort of talk about the differences between the two. I also wanted to touch on what, as I see it, that the most important ways in which parish councils can sort of influence and get their hands on funding from those developer contributions. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how parish councils can work with Section 106 spending, and also critically how parish councils can get the most out of their CIL allocations. The final slide and the final part of the presentation really is talking about my experience of engaging with parish councils and the best way to get the most out of your local planning authority offices, based on the understanding that planning itself, and especially CIL and developer contributions, can be quite complex, and getting hold of the right people and talking to them in the way that makes sense to you is very important. So if we can move on to the first section, please, Ian. Section 106 and CIL are both contributions that developers have to make when they do developments. But there are some really important differences between the two. Section 106 is a negotiated legal agreement that forms part of a planning application. A local authority will say to a developer during a planning application, or even as part of pre-application advice, this is how much we think you're going to need to spend, and you're going to need to spend it on these things. And those things will be related specifically to the development. They will usually be within the red line plan of the development. So they'll usually be directly in with the new houses or the new development that's being built. So they'll be highly sort of site specific, but they may include things like building, pedestrian links or cycle paths to and from the development. So they would be outside the boundary. But they can deal with crucial things like sustainable urban drainage systems, so to prevent flooding. Of course, play parks would be a big part of that, and things like affordable housing. So that's a really big pot that can take up a lot of Section 106. CIL is different. CIL is a fee that is leveraged on a percentage basis, so it's not negotiable. So a developer can't turn around and say, well, we can't afford to pay CIL, so we want to pay less. There's no negotiation available. There is a published percentage. Each authority should have a table showing how much they leverage and how much is available from each development. So it's a fixed tariff fee. This still needs to be, CIL money still needs to be spent on infrastructure projects, but it can be allocated on a much more broad basis. So obviously there's a portion of that gets allocated to parish councils, and that's either 15 or 25%, depending on whether you've got a neighbourhood plan. But it's a lot more flexible, so it can be spent on a lot more things. It still has to be infrastructure spending, but it could be spent on maintaining pieces of infrastructure, which Section 106 can't be. So you could have a play park. You might want to upgrade it with CIL payments, and you can then spend some money on maintaining the play park, or securing the play park, or lighting the play park. All on the basis that 200 houses on the edge of the village means that you're going to get another 45 kids playing in that play park. So that's a brief run through of Section 106 and CIL. it's a lot more. There are a lot more complexities and nuances, and I'm happy to answer. We could take a run through some of those at the end. If we go on to the next slide, please, Ian. The Section 106 can seem like it can be a big pot of money that can seem a little bit distant from parish councils. It's not immediately obvious how you can have any influence on how it's spent, but you can influence it. What you can part of the issue with big major housing schemes is that they'll often attract a lot of objections from local residents. You'll all be familiar with how that works. The first thing to say is that you can engage positively with a developer whilst still objecting to the proposal, and that is done on the basis of that. I suppose the way I think about it, and the thing I say to parish councils is try and imagine that you object to this proposal for lots of very good reasons, but it may be that the proposal gets allowed anyway. So an inspector may allow it based upon the very high housing targets that the government have set up. And it's part of our job as officers, and it can be part of the job of the parish councils as well, to try and get the best possible development that may get allowed at some point in the future anyway. So if you can influence Section 106 spending on a development that you don't want, at least when the development does get permitted by an inspector, you can say, well, actually, we have worked quite hard to try and improve this application. So what I would say is that when you consulted on major housing development particularly, try and give detailed sort of, evidence-based responses to consultations, especially on when developers are asking you how you think that you should spend Section 106, how they should spend Section 106. Obviously, if you've got a published neighbourhood plan, you can have sections within that saying these are where we think that Section 106 spending would need to happen when major development comes through on our allocated sites. Something that I'll touch on again with the CIL is you can produce something called an infrastructure plan. So this can be within a neighbourhood plan, it often is, but it can be separate. So if you don't have a neighbourhood plan, you can still put together an infrastructure plan. And this can set out a wish list of things that you would like to spend, that you'd like to see Section 106 spending used for when new developments come forward. So a good example would be that let's say you're in a village, let's say there's 1,000 houses in the village, and you've got a 400 housing development. So it's a massive increase in the amount of people using that village. Let's say the village has got 3 play parks, but you, from your local knowledge, know that they're all on the wrong side of town for the development. So you could quite reasonably say in your response to the planning application that it is absolutely critical that Section 106 spending within that application is used to provide play facilities on site. And the reason for that is that the people in the new site wouldn't be able to reach the existing play parks in the town. So that's just one example. Obviously, in Section 106 money, I'll move on from this because it's a big topic. I'll move on from it shortly. But Section 106 money can also be used to fund. It's basically any big. So it can be used sustainable urban drainage, play parks, highways, and affordable housing. So affordable housing forms a massive part of a consideration of any big major planning application. So it may be that the developer wants to use a lot of it to spend on affordable housing. It may be that as a parish council, you have a view on what sort of affordable housing would make the most sense in your area. So it may be that you know that there are very few 2-bed, so small, say two bed family units for small families starting out. So you could feed that information into the developer. One thing I would say is that it's difficult to engage with planning officers. They're quite busy. There aren't as many of them as we would like. But developers will absolutely bite your hand off generally if you try and engage with them early, because they sort of see it as, well, they have to engage with local with parish councils and local communities. And if you're sending them shopping lists of things that you want Section 106 money and CIL money to go onto, they will absolutely love that, because they can put that in their planning application and they can talk about it at planning committee and say, well, actually, we've had this long list of things that we think we should spend this Section 106 money on, and this is where the CIL money can go. So they will be delighted to hear from you, because it makes their job, their engagement, or their legal obligation to engage with the local community, it makes their job easier. So Okay, let's move on now, Ian, if we can, to the CIL section. So obviously CIL payments are different. You know, we know that they, through the neighbourhood levy, they can come down to parish councils to be used. The first thing is quite a big ask, but the difference between having a neighbourhood plan and not having a neighbourhood plan is 10%, and that's quite a lot of money. So if you do have the resources to put together a neighbourhood plan, then that is certainly something I would start doing as soon as you can to maximise your entitlement. Obviously, within the neighbourhood plan, you can also include things like an infrastructure plan, a big long list of things that you know that the local area needs and will need more of when development comes forward. Something that we see quite often is that because of the way our local democracy runs, certainly at the district level and at the county level, members will often want to see CIL money spent on things that's flashy, that sort of looks like a quick win. So a couple of new benches here and there, some bins here and there, you know, more bin collection, something like that. So stuff that is politically expedient rather than, you know, has a long-term benefit. So I would certainly look to, when you're putting together an infrastructure plan or a list of things that you want to spend money on, try and avoid things that are solely just for an immediate benefit. Something else, and point 4 actually, is that it's not always clear to parish councils, that CIL money can be spent on a massive array of different things. It's very flexible, and that the things it can be spent on can fall way outside of what parish councils are responsible for, but it's still your money to allocate to those things. For instance, CIL money can be used to secure extra GP appointments. It can be spent on improvements to the highways. It can be spent on increasing certain school capacity, NHS capacity. It can be spent on all sorts of things which you can show are required because of the pressure of new housing development. So I wouldn't restrict your thinking just to the things that parish councils normally have responsibility for. If you've got, we all know the sorts of problems that smaller villages and bigger towns have. There's always that particular roundabout that's sort of dangerous and really bad for pedestrians, or there's a bit of pavement that's totally unusable for anybody, you know, with a pushchair or a wheelchair. And you try and get that onto a scheme of works for the local highways authority, and you know you're not going to see anything for years because they budget so far ahead. But with CIL money, you can go in and say, well, the budget's available now, and here's a contract. We can, you know, these are the contractors that will do the work, and then all the highways authority has to do is approve the work, which will be very straightforward. It should be straightforward. So that's just one example of how the money could be spent. So there's obviously a very long list of things that can be spent. Something that not all parish councils do this, but you can collaborate with other parish councils. So it's not uncommon for big housing developments to stretch across 2 parishes, or even if the development itself isn't right inside your parish, for it to have a clear and obvious effect on your parish. So it may be that you can collaborate with nearby parish councils to do longer term infrastructure work with CIL money that could have a really seriously positive effect on both council areas. Match funding, so CIL money can be used to gain funding from other sources. You can say, well, we've got £48,000 of funding here for this play park, and you can find funding from other areas to sort of match that. So that's a very good way of using CIL money. So I put the final point, number 5, and this feeds onto the last slide I'm going to present on, is engaging with the LPA, and that is easier said than done. You know, it can be very difficult to get a response from your local authority in the way that you need. But the local planning authority will have a matrix of different projects, and it will be ranked according to where they would like to see CIL money spent. So right at the top will be things like priorities set out within the local plan. So the local plan will have a list of things that clearly need money spent on them. And so those will be, if they get requests from parish councils that accord with the local plan, for example, they will be given priority. There's no doubt about that. But understanding that matrix and understanding that ranking system from your local planning authority is critical. But getting to the point where you can say that that's happened is easier said than done, which leads on to my final slide. So in public service, you've got this problem where if you send in a query to a team or a planning officer or somebody who works within a statutory function, they have to respond to your query. If your query is big and complicated and has a lot of data in it or has a lot of sort of extraneous information, they have to validate all of that and understand it and investigate it before they can even respond to you. And it may be that they have to then run some of that information past other managers or other officers, and they then have to get it signed off by another manager. So all I would say is to bear in mind there's a big wormhole that your queries can disappear into. The more complicated and long-winded your queries are, the more likely they are to bounce around the organisation for a few weeks, if not much longer, than if you're able to send through a couple of quick, snappy requests for information. Point two, I would certainly try and use your locally elected members. So whether that's at the county level, I wouldn't use them to put pressure on the services, because that they are still subject to that big wormhole. So any query they make, any pressure they put on, still has to go through the same channels. It still has to be agreed and validated by the same people. And if anything, it will make the information take longer. What I would use members for is information. So find out from your local member they can just walk into the office and say, right, I've got a parish clerk who needs to talk to someone about section 106. They'll go straight up to the right person and they'll get their email address for you. And that should be something they can do. They should be able to get you an email address or get you a telephone number or get you some contact with the actual officers, with the actual team that matters. I think from that point on, what I would suggest is trying to develop a single point of contact. So it can be easy to get bounced around different teams. Lots of different teams contribute to the planning decision-making process, and they're quite varied. So I'd try and find a single point of contact. Most authorities should have Section 106 CIL contribution officers. So I think Wiltshire probably has several. It probably has a team. And trying to get a contact with them is really important. And I would sort of try and develop that relationship by asking sort of very specific questions, quite keeping them brief and trying to get the information you need without a big complicated query disappearing down that wormhole. So I've touched on already, try not to submit large amounts of information that are just without any warning. So if you submit a big document saying, we've done all this work on this, we need you to look at it and come back to us, that is going to take months. They're going to have a load of other stuff that they need to do first. Number 6 can be a bit difficult, but if you can get in front of the right officer, you can ask them. You've got all these millions of queries. You can just ask them and make notes. Can you send us your list of priorities for CIL? Yes. What's on the list? How do we receive the money? Can you help us with our neighbourhood plan? So I would suggest trying to get that single point of contact and get in front of them is really important. And I suppose to bear in mind is if you think about the competing demands on planning policy officers' time, I would hold in my mind, how do I make it easier for them to get back to me? And you can do that by asking really simple questions, that sort of draw them into your orbit really, rather than bombarding them with big, complicated documents, however important those be. And there will be a point where those big documents have to be looked at, things have to be analysed. So those are my thoughts on how to engage with the LPA, and that comes from sort of 15, 20 years of doing it. And I hope that's been of some use. Ian, I think the last slide, really we're just looking for some questions.